Hello, and welcome to Snapshot, an audio moment in time with people who are not famous. I'm your host, Jerry McDonald, and today is Sunday, January 7th, 2018. I've had the good fortune to sit down and interview people from different labeled generations. For example, I've spoken to some from the greatest generation, born between 1910 and 1925, who are generally associated with World War II. And I've spoken to some from the silent generation, born 1925 to 1945, who served the Korean War. I am a member of the baby boom generation, born 1946 to 1979. Ours was the Vietnam War. But I've not yet spoken to Generation X, born 1975 to 1985, and theirs was the Iraq War. Today, I am excited to have in front of me a member of the millennial generation, a group born 1980 through 1994, 1995, and they have inherited the worst war, the war on terrorism. It has no borders, no uniforms, at least on the other side, and conceivably no end either. When I talk with people from the greatest generation, I get to hear about how things were in the past. It's fascinating, but no less, it's already happened. What I hope to understand today is how things are currently and how things might be in the future. The millennials have arrived and have grown up with the most fantastic advancement in new technology constantly and are poised to guide mankind into the future. They are in the house. So let's get going and jump into this technically sophisticated generation with my guest here today. But before we begin, I have to ask my guest a question. Are you ready for my question?
Yes, I am.
Are you famous?
I am not.
Good. That qualifies you to be on the show. So let's find out who we're talking to today. What's your name?
My name is Aaron Matthew Pravecek.
Aaron, when were you born?
I was born October 18th, 1990.
So that makes you a millennial.
It does indeed.
And where were you born?
I was born in Fort Collins, Colorado.
Pravecek, does that have a European lineage to it?
Yes, it's Czech. From what I've looked up on it, you have like the location, so like Prague or Praha. Usually the last name is Pravecek, and then because our family immigrated, you have a corruption in it, which is Ve. So Pravecek means a Czech who's left.
Okay. I'm assuming that the Pravecek name resides on your father's side. Do you know anything about your mother's side?
My mother, due to her mother having multiple marriages, both of which involving Department of Navy, which is interesting. Also both Slavic last names with Grgic, which is it's currently now one of the prior Yugoslav republics. I think it's Serbian. And the other one, I think, was Dieger, which is actually Netherlands in origin, but the individual in question was probably most Slavic. But I'd have to go back into an online tree or something at this point.
That's quite interesting, and it's fairly rich. Have you ever been over to the old world?
I have not.
Do you have any desire that someday?
Due in large part to a lot of the current political issues over there, it's something that I think interests me to visit, but at the same time, especially due with, as I said before, a lot of the political issues troubling the EU right now, I think I'm better off kind of staying away, which is one of those things that's interesting in an information age like today is we can form opinions about places we've never visited or even talked to people about, and yet nevertheless be very staunch in these beliefs. For example, as you said, I'm diametrically aligned to this, and yet I formed an opinion as such that I refuse to go there right now. So it's a little weird now that you bring it up.
Well, right now is right now, but you never know about the future.
Absolutely.
There's a lot of history over there. Help me with the math. So your age is?
I'm 27 now.
Okay. And where did you go to school?
Went to school,
Grade school.
Be Olander Elementary back in Fort Collins.
So you grew up for a while in Fort Collins?
Yes, indeed.
You were born there, correct?
Yep.
I believe you said that. And then you went on to high school?
Yep. High school was in Denver. It was Bishop Matchbuff. High school was a Catholic school.
And then did you elect to go to college?
Yes, I did.
And where was that?
That would be CU Boulder, University of Colorado, Boulder.
Good. Where you got a degree in?
Electrical engineering.
And how or why electrical engineering out of the myriad of choices that CU offers?
Yep. CU actually prided itself on aerospace, which is what I tried for. After seeing the grade point requirement as well as my own personal performance there, I stagnated for a year, did not do very well. In fact, one of the reasons my current job is what it is because my academic performance wasn't up to snuff in my first year. So after talking to the counselor, they pretty much said, well, aerospace isn't going to be it, and neither will mechanical. But then I looked at it and I'm like, well, electrical seems to be stuff that I can get my head around. And at that point, ended up investing a lot more time into that. I knew I wanted to be an engineer, but the exclusivity of aerospace kind of prohibited me from doing that. So I pursued electrical and found out that I liked it.
So you said aerospace a couple of times. What drew you, and was this something from childhood? Did you build model planes? Heck, they probably didn't have model planes back then, but was there something about the sky or the technology early on in your life?
That's actually kind of funny because I can say without a doubt there was no inspiration outside of the idea of being able to brag. It's a very egotistical thing to admit, but I think that's something that a lot of people, when they see, oh, aerospace engineering, wouldn't that be nice? It's a feather to put in your cap. And at the end of the day, CU had a huge attrition rate for aerospace. In fact, engineering in general, you'd have 75% of oncoming students would change degrees or drop out. Aerospace was a big reason for that. You have this generation of dreamers who are told that all they need is to pat themselves on the back and hope hard enough. And then they look at their calculus paper, they look at the classes, and they start to realize that no amount of Carl Sagan and no amount of, Neil deGrasse Tyson is going to inspire them to be smarter. So they end up, hanging their heads, realizing that engineering is a hell of a lot more than just hoping that you'll succeed.
It's a little bit more than I want to be an astronaut.
Absolutely.
And I have to think when you hear about some of the precision that is required to land something on an incoming or outbound asteroid, that's pretty precise. And when you look at even the simplest of moonshots and how they circled the moon in a certain way and knew how to leave gravity, and there is a lot of math involved in that.
Oh, absolutely.
Were you strong in math in grade school, high school?
In grade school and high school, I was an average performer at best. In fact, in high school, it was split up pretty much between those doing really advanced, good courses, and then those who were just dragging along to do their best. And that was unfortunately a dichotomy the school just went with, where, you have a forced curriculum. And in the U.S., we're not exactly renowned for our public education, at least not right now. So the thing is that I ended up for the first half of high school being with those, the lower end of performance, and then ended up, being pushed mostly by my parents to, do a bit better later on. And ended up, despite the math courses not being something I would jump ahead on, I did take a physics course, which was a lot math, heavier, so to speak. And ended up finding that at least when I could apply things, it was, when it's more engaging, I performed better.
So the physics came to you a little bit easier.
Yes.
And there are physical aspects to physics, correct?
That'd be fair to say.
Where mathematics is
purely theory.
Something theoretical and intangible. Okay, so you graduated with an electrical engineering, or is there a specific?
No, it's just electrical engineering degree, bachelor's of science. And then CU also likes to have, their little specialties they add onto it. So for when you go into industry, what you have a little bit more exposure on one or two topics. And the two that I chose were electromagnetic fields and waves, and then control systems, because I always liked robotics.
Okay, and what did they tell you could do with these degrees besides self-satisfaction for the knowledge that you had?
Absolutely. For electromagnetic fields and waves, the thing that appealed to me was stealth technology. That's, you figure about how to match waves to certain things. You learn, the clever tricks of, we're not making this jet look invisible. We're making it look like air with an impedance of 311 ohms or something. And then controls engineering, robots, which is all I had to be told. So I'm like, in the back of my head, being, a young college graduate, the naivete is at its prime. And I'm thinking to myself, stealth robots, this is the future. And, unfortunately, industry and, market forces being what they were wasn't exactly what was in store for me. But nevertheless, a man can dream, I suppose.
Well, that's interesting because a little bit later in the conversation, when we talk about your prognostication on the future, I think robots may come up again. Yep. Did you build any robots or fabricate anything along the way to getting good?
CU has notoriously been a big proponent of project-based learning, which for better or for worse, when people, are imbibed with the idea of a project class, you're always, stuck with the stereotypes of the person who worked hard, the person who slacks off, the person who doesn't do anything to the last minute. And, you encounter all those things in spades, and that's not something that's going to, particularly be beneficial to delve into now.
Are you speaking of group projects?
Yep, group projects, of course. And, while I think everyone already has their opinions on that particular matter, at the end of the day, CU wanted you to have something to show. And every single semester, when given an opportunity, for me, it would just boil down to some type of robot. It'll be, oh, we have this drone that you guys can make. And I'm like, it's already half robot. Now we have to make it do something.
So did you make a drone?
Yep. We made a drone that went off of almost purely analog signals, which was really tricky to work with. That was just a sophomore year project. By the time we had capstone, which was 100%, you guys do what you want. Just tell us what market you're going for. And we ended up coming up with a quadcopter. You can actually look it up on YouTube. But we called it PTAC. The whole thing is supposed to be a pain in the ass quadcopter, but we ended up.
Is that the mnemonic pain in the ass? Okay.
And then we had to make it so it actually could go to the expo. So I came up with the mnemonic of Pi integrated tracking autonomous quadcopter, which is just a bunch of buzzwords to make it all fit.
But what does that sound out?
It sounds out PTAC again.
Oh, again.
So,
okay.
The whole fun of it was just supposed to follow someone like 3 feet behind. Most quadcopters work really well at high altitudes.
Mm-hmm.
But I found it interesting to have like a companion quadcopter, something right behind you. Now, my initial purpose for this, and I never really told anyone this, but I was thinking about maybe prisoner escort or something where you could have it where it would be in a volatile environment where you needed close surveillance over personnel, or and for me, one thing that I know, whether or not people like to admit it or not, military application will always have a market. So I thought, well, I do like military and I do like robots, so this strikes me as something cool. But you can't really go to a liberal college like CU and say, hey, I want to put a gun on this thing and have it follow folks. So we ended up coming up with a cover story of, oh, we can have this be a third-person simulator. So you can attach a camera to it and you can give yourself a third-person view, which, of course, studies have shown on similar projects that it's very dizzying. Only a very specific demographic will go for that. But what I found actually funny on the background, especially once we had the project made and, signed, sealed, delivered, got our grade, I thought about it to myself. I'm like, I had a real application that I would put this for, but to make it more socially acceptable, I had to make it frivolous and ridiculous in order for it to actually be seen as usable.
That was a great answer, and it begets about 5 different questions, one of them being one you just answered now, which is that not only did you have to understand the engineering and the physics and the math to put this flying machine together, you actually had a true life purpose that you felt ran afoul of a philosophy that the university might be known for.
Yeah.
You mentioned the word liberal university. Can you go into detail about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So CU, most college environments nowadays tend to be much more liberally minded, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. I'll always stand by the idea that college universities are a place to exchange and share ideas. And in recent years, they've exploded with a lot of these new ideas, not least of which, my generation is responsible for, with social justice warriors, individuals doing their best to try and fix inequalities, whether they be real or perceived. And it's an interesting thing, but nevertheless, environments like that tend to be very inundated with individuals from a certain type of background, and especially the way that universities are run nowadays, they're more so businesses than education centers. You'll have it where individuals go in there with a fat wad of money. They spend a lot of time with individuals who oftentimes can be just an echo chamber from what they've seen online, or from what their personal beliefs are, without any real life experience. Because you have to remember, the actual demographic is young students out of high school, no real work or life experience. And of course, I'm part of that demographic at the time, but nevertheless, my upbringing brought me a little bit more conservative, wherein a lot of the individuals who could afford college, and especially on CU, which the majority of the campus is made up of arts and sciences, you'll have the arts side tend to be a little bit more liberal minded, a little bit more peace-minded. And I don't mean to say that in a negative connotation, because I don't think there's anyone here who has an issue with peace, so to speak. But for me, what I found fascinating was, military. I found the idea of making these machines that can, apply to that sort of thing. Growing up with war movies and stuff myself, I found that to be cool, but that's not something that's necessarily seen as beneficial. I had a friend, Jesse, in college, who once asked me one day, as he's laying on the grass in, true beatnik fashion, He's like, oh, so what are you going to do? Once you get your degree, he knew that I would be graduating a lot sooner than he was. And I was like, well, and I didn't have the heart to tell him that I wanted to go to the Department of Defense, work on, at the time, DARPA was working on Atlas, which was a 6'10", 400-pound humanoid robot, a fascinating machine in its own right. They would end up finishing that project and actually leasing it out to other individuals, which DARPA doing what it does best, which is, innovate for the military. I saw that and I was like, I couldn't tell them that I want to work for the DoD and have them do whatever crazy, secret squirrel stuff they want me to do. I ended up telling him something about renewables, if I remember right, which, he took right up on, which is, totally fine in and of itself, but it wasn't where my passion lied. So
right. A lot of people don't know this, but historically, the civilizations that were incubating in what we now call Western Europe, Western civilization, back in the Dark Ages, it was only when the kings and the dukes and the lords started paying educational institutions for their science and artistic accomplishments that allowed those civilizations to rise. At the same time, China and some of the Far Eastern nations had inklings of technology and arts, but they were not funded, and that's why Western civilization is what it is today, because people with money started paying for inventions.
Mm-hmm. I buy it.
Before we go on to your future, did you work at all?
Yes.
In your life coming up through college?
Yeah, I had a number of small odd jobs. I would work at a Target, which, the retail store, not particularly glamorous. I have random stories about how that place all worked, but again, I just worked in the back room there. I would work at, after college, I would work at a Qdoba while I waited for pretty much a passing period before I could get a bus to boot camp. I was just a cook. And then one of the most formative jobs I had, which was a single day, was I worked at a hat factory. I was one of the few workers who spoke English as opposed to Vietnamese. It was one of the most miserable times I ever had. You just see the inner workings of a factory and people who, are forced to do this incredibly menial labor.
Let me repeat what you just said. You worked for how long?
The hat factory was 1 day.
1 day. How does one get, I think I know how one loses a 1 day job, but how does one get a 1 day job? And
can you sign up for a temp agency where you're like, hey, I'm looking for any old work you guys can throw me at. They were kind of incredulous because they're like, oh, okay, well, we have this one thing that can't seem to hold on to people. And me, at the time, I think it was maybe, 18 or 19. And I was like, look, I desperately need a job. I've been looking all summer and I just need something. So I'll do any work you can throw my way, digging ditches, whatever, to just make a buck and get out of home. So they threw me, two, Imperial hats. And you get in there, it's loud. Your supervisor is some 14-year-old whose dad owns the whole company. And all you do is you're just ripping out this white stuff in the back of golf caps, like those, if you ever go to a golf course and you see that they've got a little mini store, that very likely some sweatshop, even stateside, will pump it out. And that was one of the, I wouldn't say I was disillusioned with it, but it was one of those times where after having to work for about 11 hours straight, and then this woman who was the work center supervisor looks at me and says, oh yeah, we see you tomorrow. We see you tomorrow. And I'm like, yeah. And
were you just speaking Vietnamese, sir?
About as much as I know. The workers were fine and nice, but it was obvious that, by their calloused hands, they'd been doing this day in and day out. I was the only person of my position. It looks like they were just trying to hire out any old person they could get to just, increase output a little bit.
So demographically, as you looked around, if you were all to take a lunch at the same time, would your lunch be different from most of the other people there? Okay.
Definitely.
Okay. And the decision to make this a 1 day career, was
yours? On me.
Okay.
I heard them say, yeah, we'll see you tomorrow. Left the building, called my parents, said, okay, hey, I'm going to be picked up. And I walked home. I remember talking to my parents, and I said, I am not going back. And my mom was like, well, I understand, that's fine, but you know that they'll probably not call you back again. That agency's not going to take you if you just walked out of a job. And I'm like, I will never go back to that job where the sewing machines are making you deaf. There's no one to really talk to. Your lunch period is about 30 minutes long. And, I thought it was maybe a lack of perception on my part. I thought maybe I'll never make it in the workforce. And at the end of the day, I stand by it. From any job I've had, it's still better than that damn hat factory.
So have you, in the time since, considered your good fortune in that you had a choice not to go back? There are people that did go back the next day.
Mm-hmm.
Any thoughts or impact?
Absolutely. It's very illuminating, I should say. And again, I don't want to go on a large spiel of like, oh, there's such inequality in the world, because it's something everyone's aware of to one degree or another.
Always has been, always will be.
Yep. And at the end of the day, I did understand as I walked to my, parents' house, this full house, nearly paid for. And I got to play video games on these consoles, to calm myself after what was but a single day of work. And now that you bring it up, it's very illuminating, because there are people who didn't have the luxury of saying, well, I won't go back to that.
Sometimes, not always, but sometimes our fate is partially cast by the odds of who we were born to.
Absolutely.
And it's something, in my case, I feel quite fortunate about. So you had your one-day job, and that made the impression on you. I want to play a little game here. It's not really a game.
All right.
Per se, like we're used to. There's no dice. But at, you said 27? That's your age? You've lived 4 half decades. Plus 2 extra years.
Bam.
And I want to just get a recollection if there is a single emotion or memory or a summary of each of those decades. Now, the first one from 0 to 5, that takes you up through kindergarten. Maybe not much there, but anything that comes back to you?
No, nothing major from kindergarten. I'm still, formative years, barely remembering anything. And if it was there, it's just a stray memory.
Okay. 6 through 10, that's kindergarten to about 5th grade. 6th grade.
I remember, as far as and this is just really frivolous, but I remember it because on the 4th of July of 2000, there was an anime. This is before I knew what anime was. It turned out to be one of my hobbies, just watching these, Japanese cartoons.
Okay. Going to jump in just so a few others out there who may not know what anime is. Can you tell me just briefly what that is, and then we'll come back to the 4th of July?
Yeah. Anime is just cartoons made by Japan, functionally. It's something that has... Yeah, it has a very iconic style, so to speak.
Okay.
The topics thereof are, can
be like any other cartoon.
Yeah.
Okay. So it's 2000, 4th of July. You discovered your first anime.
Yep. It was actually the day prior, but I remember my father wanted to go to this place called Red Walrus, which is an ice cream shop. But as a kid, I couldn't tell time. And I remember that another episode of that show was going to broadcast that day. So I spent all day watching the Cartoon Network, like show after show. And as a young kid, you can...
Of anime or looking?
No, just cartoons in general. Okay. Because you're doing your best not to miss that one show.
You were looking for it.
Yep, you're looking for it. And that there's only one way to make sure you don't miss it, and that's to keep watching. So I remember watching, I just inundated hours of Captain Planet, which as a young kid I was already kind of bored with. But after about your 4th or 5th hour of that, you're just hoping for the sweet embrace of death or something. It turns out, my dad would end up saying, hey, it's time for us to go. We're gonna go eat some ice cream. We're gonna have a good time. And me being a bit of an, impudent little slime that I was, didn't want to leave the TV. Kind of pouted the whole way through there. We got ice cream. I wasn't particularly in the mood. I wanted to see the show. We got back home. My dad was rather upset with me and he didn't throw me, but he functionally threw me back in my room and said, here's your stupid show. He turns it on. And what was before my eyes was the end credits of the show I wanted to see. I think it was Tenchi Muyo, which is all things considered a terrible show by today's standards. But young me was fascinated with the style.
Yeah.
So
that's a memory you have. And now your father, having raised children myself and probably had my own timing off a little bit, was probably trying to do a good thing with the ice cream.
Absolutely.
And this cartoon was beckoning.
Yeah. It's a weird thing because I look back on it and I'm like, both of us, my dad could have just put it up and brought back ice cream, right? I could have just been a little bit, less selfish, but...
That's a fair and balanced observation about that. So you discovered anime and you still like ice cream?
Yes, indeed.
Okay. Let's go to 11 to 15, middle school to maybe high school. You're leading up to driving at the end of this period.
Middle school, I remember I ended up becoming friends with this guy, Vincent, and all we did was just I'm trying to think of a politically correct way. We were just being little turds. Like we would go up to people and lie to them, say, hey, Sally wants to see you. Walk away, titter, titter. And then we were just kind of, I don't know if it was for the attention or what, we were being just pretty much little jerks.
Vincent was your best friend?
You know what? Not even my best friend. My best friend at the time, I think, was a gentleman called Colin Bellis, and about as socially awkward as I was at the time. But for whatever reason, we did these obnoxious things. Ended up having to get counseled on just how annoying we were being. And I think the reason I remember that
by
is
somebody at school?
Is actually the teachers would end up, because they'd end up, you have people asking teachers to solve this little problem.
So your hijinks made it up to an authority source.
Yep. And it was the reason I remember it so well is it's with a little bit of shame I look back on it, but it's that social maladjustment that I had, which, as embarrassing as it was to have, I'm grateful that I learned it at that time, because there are individuals that I even see in my workplace today who are they're just socially inept, and it's hard to deal with, especially in adulthood or working at a job that you feel has a lot of import to it. And you see a person who you're like, oh my goodness, did you have no friends? Did you have no way to pick up on these social clues? And it's painful. So as upset as I am that it happened, I am grateful that it happened as early as middle school. So
we're going to go into that in a little bit, because I'd like to talk to you about the effect of some of the technology waves that you've been through on people in society. But I want to ask you a question. Do you watch or about the show The Simpsons?
Yes, indeed.
And you know that several times a season, Bart calls up Moe's bar and asks him some free question. Oh, yep. So, that's a pretty common trait, those kinds of hijinks for kids. Yeah. And you should probably feel lucky enough that one of yours made it to the teacher. That means it has some quality to it.
There you go, right?
Yeah. I'd hang a ribbon on that.
There we go.
Do you recall if there was any bullying in school? That's a current topic that we hear about. It was never really something that was brought up or identified when I was growing up. Was there any peer-to-peer bullying that you experienced or saw?
Absolutely.
Or, for God's sakes, did?
So interestingly enough, when I was in elementary school, thinking back on it now, there was some punk we'll call Duncan, because that seems like a jerk name. And I remember at one point he was chasing us around, and he would push us down, right? He was about a grade or two above us. And eventually got to the point where I was with a friend of mine, and all I remember is we ended up tripping him, and I started kicking him in the knee really hard a couple times because I was tired of it, and ended up getting pulled in the principal's office because the swelling in his knee just would not go down. And they're like, "Hey, do you know what you've done?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I kicked him." And they're like, well, he's really hurt. And you see, it's that classic look. You can imagine a fourth or fifth grader with, their faces all red and blush. There's, they were crying recently, shaking a little bit because, they're actually hurt. And the weirdest thing is that, I said I was sorry because I didn't, when I heard that the swelling wasn't going down, I thought it was a problem that might have been permanent. Like I might have killed the kid. Right. But in truth, I wasn't necessarily fully regretful, because it felt to me, I'm like, well, he's pushing us. For whatever reason, he's making hostile advances towards us. I feel that if I made that in turn, it would fix it. And
so you didn't instigate.
Yeah.
You responded.
I responded. And
in kind.
In kind. And the thing that I found fascinating is it absolutely worked. The bully who had previously, goaded me into making sure I didn't tell teachers and pushed us to the ground ended up getting a taste of what he'd given us and found out he didn't like it. So I had never had a problem with him again. And, not to do this whole back in my day sort of deal, but I feel that these situations oftentimes can figure themselves out when you're willing to handle it at the lowest level, and you finally have people. It's like a forced empathy, right? Perhaps Duncan didn't understand what he was doing, but he certainly did after I was through, and I found that to be very cathartic as a young child, because you're like, it makes you feel like you have power, you have the ability to solve this. And finally, the person who seemed so much bigger than you had to call a principal to stop you. And personally, I think that was probably the best way it could have gone, because if you started getting, a bunch of parents and other people involved with it, it gets to be this very dramatic.
So you nipped it in the bud on the playground.
Absolutely.
And I'm sure you weren't doing it to be a hero, but were there others around who took notice of this and perhaps were grateful of?
Yeah. I don't know if they were grateful, but I think that a couple of my friends who were also being pushed around or whatever saw it, and they did take note that he didn't do it anymore. I shudder at the fact that it was seen as anything good that I had really done. I understand the ramifications of responding violence with violence,
okay.
the truth of the matter is that it did solve the problem. And I'm not the kind of person to question results.
Okay. And about what grade were you at this point?
I must have been in 3rd or 4th grade.
Okay. And do you remember being frightened, or was this an organic response?
Oh, I was, at the time it happened, I had this absolute rush of fear adrenaline where we got him on the ground and I was like, oh my gosh, this is the only time that kid, who seemed to be so much bigger than us, and of course that's, in my mind's eye, he was bigger than us, perhaps not. But I remember just kicking him. I was so scared. I was like, if I hurt him, maybe he won't hurt me, or if I hurt him hard enough, he can't hurt me. And it's one of those things that as a young kid, you can't really understand the human response to heal through that, or what he's actually feeling. So in truth, maybe I had a lack of empathy there as well. And
I would call that, as you describe it, a schoolyard fight.
Absolutely.
Those are very common every day. In some cases, it's a part of growing up. Did you have any other fights to the point where you would consider yourself a fighter, or did you just have an experience there where you decided you weren't going to back down?
Honestly, there have been a few times I've tried to instigate stuff, but much to my chagrin, people have either diffused them or made me embarrass myself to such an extent that I couldn't actually fight. The only other was once in high school where I pretty much got, I wasn't throw a punch, I tried to tackle someone, and as they dodged, they slapped me. And it was one of those just like, okay, if I continue this any further, right, and they embarrass me again, I won't, my reputation will be permanently sullied. So I'll look like a fool for this week and be able to walk it off the next. And another time in college.
Wait a minute, I just have to comment. That's quite insightful and I would say mature, especially for having happened in a split second like that.
Yeah, it was. It's one of those things though. Like it wasn't as though I hadn't thought about it at all. The way it plays out, especially as a young kid when you're fighting, right? The image you have is that you throw this guy to the ground and you take him out in a quick 1-2, or even if it's a scuffle, you always imagine yourself coming out on top. And then you're like, that's right. I'm some sort of, badass. And in truth, the minute that fell through, I realized which side of my fantasy I was on. And I was like, okay, the longer this gets played out, the longer this will be, will affect me. So it's time for me to deal with this shame now and, kind of walk it off.
Yeah, that's quite impressive. It sounds like you were at a fork.
Yeah.
And some people take the left and they continue fighting. And then some people take the right and pursue a life of rational thinking.
Yeah. And again, it's not to say that I wouldn't, try stuff or think of that stuff in the future, but it's one of those marks to the ego where you have to be a realist. And that's one thing I find interesting when people talk about fights, because I've been in a few, not a whole lot.
Have you ever received pain?
Yes.
Like it goes blue behind your eyeballs?
Yes. Okay. Incredible pain. I remember in college, I was charged into a dumpster once by a drunk individual. Not exactly pleasant. And here's the thing, it was just a total out of the blue thing, right? But in truth, it's one of those things where you realize, wow, this is nothing what it's coughed up to be. And when I hear people talk about, getting into fights, they're like, oh, I can't wait to show him, I'll just, one right across the face. And I think about it and I'm like, I find it miraculous how many people in their lives have won fights. And yet I've got this terrible track record. And I think about it and I'm like, either these people haven't been in as many fights as they like to say they are, or, they're totally, talking out their ass, because it's just miraculous that out of every fight, there can only be one victor. And yet miraculously, I've encountered just a series of victors. So.
Well, even the victor feels pain.
Yep.
And there's a reason that pain is called pain.
Absolutely.
So, okay, quickly, high school, or were we talking about high school? High school area. So this is like from 16 to 20, you get a driver's license.
Yeah.
Girls are starting to be girls. Guys, there's always been guys. It's not really a time to be totally serious. There are some people in that area that are serious.
High school
how was Aaron?
Yeah, high school was a little bit weird because in a school of 400 or so, it's rather small. You do start to get interested in girls, but none of them really piqued my interest in high school.
I was going to ask, any high school sweetheart?
There was one girl who, at the end of high school, she went to a high school near Talon's Reach. It wasn't mine. Her name was Claire. She had green hair. She was really nice.
So you met her outside of your high school?
Yeah.
Through a series of...
Yep. Just a series of friend of a friend.
And you were taken with her?
Yep.
And was she, and I imagine you'll tell me here in a moment, was she taken back?
Yeah.
Yeah.
We were both, romantically inclined, one will say, without going into too much detail. But the truth of the matter was, as far as that goes, is that that was probably the best breakup a person could ask for, because as I went on to college and I realized, oh man, the logistics of this are already pretty hard, us being in like different districts. We both kind of admitted that due to a lack of maturity, it's where I admitted that I'm just a really jealous type of person. And because, I didn't have constant surveillance, I was, oddly paranoid. And she admitted that due to the fact that, she's young and she's still interested in having a more active relationship, maybe it wasn't entirely unwarranted. And we just, instead of opening those wounds, we both agreed due to a lack of maturity, maybe we should kind of split off, which is upsetting because as that lingers, as the years go on, you think about it and I'm like, damn it, that was the only time I met someone who was able to admit, maybe we need to both grow up some more. And most of the other relationships is due to, stupid, frivolous things, like a person who, I remember one girl in college, like it was the last one I really did before I just pursued my studies, it was due to just texting, which was a technology at the time that had finally established itself as being a must in a relationship. And I was just tired of it. I was tired of being leashed in such a capacity. So, it was an odd thing, but that was...
So yeah. You've felt the pleasure of being in love, and we'll just call it being in love because there's many degrees, and you felt the pain of loss. Sounds like you've tried to think it through. In other words, you didn't say to yourself, damn it, I'm going to go to college and build a drone that will follow her around so I will know.
Yeah.
Anything else about high school that was significant? When you graduated, were you sure of yourself and what you wanted to do?
High school, I was sure of engineering as an idea. And I had a couple of friends who, were also, like-minded. They were going to go into some technical degrees, computer science and all that. And
what made you want to be an engineer? What did that even mean at the time? It's so broad.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a weird thing is until you actually get into it, right? Or even, let alone college, but the industry, it's hard to know. And for me, I had imagined pretty much growing up on cartoons like Dexter's Laboratory, where you have this boy genius who just, as soon as he thinks about it, he applies a wrench to some magical little metal box and suddenly it's a robot. And you're like, oh, that seems easy enough. You don't have any realistic expectation. But to me, I just knew I wanted to do something technical. You keep hearing about how STEM degrees are going to be, they're always in demand. And so far it's proven true. So I was like, well, that sounds like it'd be foolish for me to pursue something outside of that. And that sounds like something I want to do without any real idea. So you'll notice, I knew engineering. I think even in 6th grade, I knew I wanted to be engineer, but the adjective I put in front of it was technical. And you can't be a technical engineer. You can be a technician and you can be an engineer, but the hybridization of both doesn't really make sense.
At a young age, was there any influence bestowed upon you in that direction?
Definitely my father.
Okay.
My dad would work at Woodward Governor, which I think would later be bought up by HP. But I remember him complaining about he was doing the work of an engineer without being paid it because they were getting paid the big bucks, which is something that always appealed to me, and I was like, well, my dad's smart and I like to think of myself as smart. So that strikes me as a career I should go into. And I never really thought twice about it.
And then how did you start to think about narrowing engineer down into, was that trial and error?
Yeah, it was, they pretty much said, hey, what kind of engineer? And they kind of hit you at once. You're like, I've got to choose a thing. Well, I don't like chemistry a lot, so I won't be biochemical. Space sounds cool. And if I could put, rocket sciences, feather my cap, as we said before, that sounds awfully cool. So if I could just kind of sign up for that little ride, I'll go for it.
And has that been a good decision?
It was enlightening to see aerospace at the beginning. Although, at the end of it, especially the intro to aerospace, they had this, this intro course, and the seminars were actually very enlightening because you had people who previously worked at NASA give you demonstrations. And the quote I'll remember staying with me was an individual who said, hey, who here thinks that, there's some new advent technology in rockets? Is that what's holding us back? And there's a bunch of hands that go up. Obviously people who don't know what's going on. And he writes down about this 9-variable equation. He's like, this is the rocket equation. There's not a single thing here we haven't optimized. We have the best rockets we can. And if anyone here is thinking that, Russia's, Saturn rockets are better for reason A or B, that's just due to these variables being better on their side as opposed to ours. So, is there anything else? Rockets are fine. That is not a question anymore. So what's stopping us? And, he proceeds to go into this long, I won't say diatribe because it was truly informative, but it's one of those things where it's like, all right, so where's the money? And there's a bunch of people who are like, well, space is important, as they look with puppy dog eyes with no real idea as to what matters. He's like, yeah, okay, but where's the money? How are you going to convince the taxpayer that you need to put this on here? Is it a joyride? And there's some people who are like, but it's the curiosity, it's discovery. And I'm like, look, like, I'll be the first person to buy into anything for just being American, right? But you can't just throw money into the stars and hope that it'll somehow inspire people.
Right.
And it was crazy. And the very end of it, he said, what I need you guys to do is not give up on aerospace, but what I need you guys to do is invent hyperdrive. You guys need to come up with something better than rockets. And he left. And it was something that, in truth, NASA's actually developing even today. But it was, what he was telling us was to come up with a technology that had been established in science fiction, something that, we know is just filling up this big old gray bubble of, our energy mass conversion equation, pretty much breaks down once you get it, closer to the speed of light. But science fiction just kind of, washes it all over with, hyperdrive, or you have warp travel in Star Trek. And he asked us to invent it. He's like, all right, so you see this thing that's made up? You have to make it a reality. All right, goodbye.
So, do you have any feelings on the relationship between science fiction and science fact?
Absolutely. Science fiction, while at worst can be detrimental to science itself. In fact, as a person who's a big fan of robotics and artificial technology, I can't think of anything more damning than, say, the Terminator franchise. While it has inspired a lot of thought on it, it ends up having a lot of individuals become questioning and even borderline Luddites when it comes to this stuff. You'll have an artificial intelligence that can tell you, I can understand when a dog is and isn't barking. It'll recognize it, and through a long process of machine learning, which even we can't backtrack. We can backtrack the tests we put it through. We can backtrack the initial software, and we can talk about the heuristics. But when you come to the final machine, we don't 100% understand it. But we do have a machine that can identify this, right? And you will very quickly have people bring up the idea of like, Skynet's coming. The machines are going to take over and kill us all. And I'm like, don't you, this technology could help us identify this stuff. You could have it where young children are displaying certain things that we can say, this is a sign of, Parkinson's that'll develop. And if we treat it now, we can save lives. You could have it where a machine actually, you'll have it where with protein folding, you can have a large neural network of computers hooked up together and start finding ways to try and treat cancer. And yet my fear is that due to some of this more destructive fiction, you'll have people immediately scared out of their minds for some fictitious event to happen, this, artificial intelligence singularity. And on the opposite end of the spectrum, you have fiction that will inspire, and you have fiction that will draw people to ask themselves, well, why can't we do that?
And some fair amount of fiction has come true.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And I think no better is that than, and it can even be the smallest of stuff. You had, back in the 1960s, you had shoes that were phones, and now we've got, I remember one thing that was really cosmic for me is how rapid the technology has grown. In 2003 to 2005, we had the Razr, which was, I think it was Motorola that came out with it. And we were like, oh, wow, look how thin and smooth this phone is.
That's a phone. Okay.
Yeah. Back when flip phones were cool in the, early 2000s, we'd come up with smaller and smaller ones, and to the point where they were fitting into like a bulky pen.
Well, let's just take a look at, did you watch the Jetsons?
Yes.
Okay, so let's just go through a couple things there. So I can remember there was a horizontal people mover.
Yep, which we have in airports everywhere.
Everywhere. There was two-way video communication over a monitor. We
Absolutely.
Have that. I can remember them going to a dude ranch in Arizona, and there was a mechanical bull.
Yep.
We have had that for 20 years now.
Yep.
I think the one thing that we're all waiting for is the flying car.
Yeah.
Any predictions on that? I know the technology will probably come around, but how do you...
Yeah, the logistics of it, which is like the real problem, because I'm not a civil engineer. It'd be up to them to kind of determine how that would go. Currently, in 2018, not only do we have, say automated cars, but we're actually getting them where a lot of them are being automatically compatible with that.
States right now are trying to figure out laws because they know they're coming.
Yep, it's actually kind of a great thing because while a lot of people are scared of this automation coming forward, I personally am excited, especially in the United States.
Well, that thought there about people's fears, I want to park it for a moment because I have an area here towards the end that I want to add some other things to. But I do want to get your opinion. Do you feel that science fiction writers are predictive, or is it that, do they know what's coming, or is it that scientists have been influenced by them and tend to model their thinking down? I would
attribute it more to the latter. But the truth is that with science fiction writers, oftentimes the things that they are incorporating are solutions to problems that they see in everyday life. and they come up with an inventive solution, but they don't have the how.
The means to do it. So they foresee an outcome.
Yes.
But they don't have the electrons.
Yeah. The gut work isn't worked through, but nevertheless, the problem, until that's invented, remains. And so it's up to the scientists and engineers to find up the how behind the why. And that's how we end up coming up with this sort of stuff.
Okay, very good. So you graduate, you go to the graduation ceremony, you get pictures taken with your folks, you clean out your dorm room, you say goodbye to some good friends who, by the way, quickly, are there friends that you're still in touch with? And are there any friends, fellow students that you think will be great in their field?
Yeah. I could say that I've my friend Harry, who, that's not his American name, but that's all I can properly pronounce, so I just call him Harry.
Is he, I guess...
he immigrated from China.
Okay.
He ended up joining the Army. He enlisted because it's the fastest way to immigrate currently. And whenever I thought about Harry enlisting into something, I always thought, when it came to my enlistment in the Navy, I was like, if it's good enough for him, it's good enough for me.
Okay, we're going there in just a second. He was a fellow engineering student?
No, actually, he was in communications. He's a big fan of marketing and stuff. But the thing is that he has a real eye for what appeals to people. And also he is he's a fairly articulate individual while simultaneously having a lot of good backgrounds, being well-traveled.
So Harry is a candidate to be a lifelong friend?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, and you guys stay in touch. Where does he live geographically?
He's currently in Washington.
Okay. Back to my setup. You clean out the dorm. You threw away or recycle all of your term papers. You're loading up the car. You head back home?
Yeah. Headed back home to try and pursue a new job.
Where was home?
Home would be in Denver, Colorado at this point.
So you went to high school in Denver. You went to grade school. So you moved somewhere from Fort Collins.
Yeah, we actually would move from Fort Collins, and then in middle school we would move to Aurora, Colorado.
Okay.
And then we would eventually move to Denver due to the whole housing market and stuff being what it was.
Okay. So by the time you graduated, you came home to Denver.
Yes, indeed.
Okay. And what happened? You had this degree, and the world was knocking at your door, beating it down.
One would hope.
Come work.
But the truth of the matter is that my grades, my freshman year, were abysmal. Multiple failed courses. I didn't have a real grasp on how to study. So,
but is that not unusual for a first-year student?
It's not. But due to the transition between my first and last year, and also the way the job market was, it's not how it is today. We were just recovering from the recession of 2008 in 2014, and while there were plenty of jobs, so to speak, the ones that I was looking for Department of Defense, you really needed to have a great GPA and probably a foot in the door, someone who had already worked there before. My GPA was not that great. I didn't have any I had plenty of projects to put my name on, but I had no prior work experience with any of these companies.
Did you get a chance to interview much?
I interviewed with a couple of jobs, none of them the DoD, and the truth is that I was on hold for one of them. It was like just a contracting job for 6 months. The money wasn't too bad, but at the end of the day, all the jobs I got interviewed for were just telecommunications. It was, oh, do you want to set up these towers? Do you want to help give us better coverage? And at the end of the day, I thought about my degree and I thought about what I wanted to do, and it felt, I won't say like a betrayal, but it felt as though when I was looking at that paper, as to what the job actually entailed, I thought to myself, am I going to be here for 4 to 6 years, under this contract?
Which is a lot of time away from a true career.
Absolutely. And then and I thought to myself, what's worse is how am I progressing towards what I want, right? It's, and again, it's not a destination, it's a journey, but I was thinking to myself, I know all about these. These are the problems that I solved in college.
So that sounds like good thinking. One meant to preserve your original intention, but were you feeling pressures to take a job?
The truth of the matter is, with any technical degree, is within 5 years it'll be outmoded, right? Every single month that passed, there was another younger engineer getting a better education with the newer technology. So if I had waited too long, simply put by merit of when I got my degree, with a less than competitive GPA, I'd be unhireable.
Or if you started down a near similar path, but not the exact path, you could still be on that path today.
Yeah.
Okay. So what did you do?
Well, after looking for a bit, didn't exactly get the engineering job I wanted. I decided that, well, there's one thing I know that'll get me security clearance, which is better than a doctorate when it comes to the Department of Defense. And it was, I could go to the military. And so, I did what every person who joins the Navy did. And you go to the Air Force recruiter and you hope to God that they're there. Needless to say, the entirety of the program I'm in right now will have stories about how the Air Force was not there or how they were directed to the Navy.
So what do you mean by that? You go to the Air Force recruiter and you hope they're not there?
Yeah, the fact of the matter is that the Air Force, due to us not needing air bases the way we did, due to us having a lot of military budget cuts and stuff, the Air Force is not in desperate need of personnel.
Well, doesn't the Navy fly?
Oh, absolutely. Navy does fly.
But the Air Force doesn't.
Yeah, not in the same way.
Okay.
And in the same capacity, the Air Force as well, with the clever nickname Chair Force, very well known for the easier workload.
Okay. And so wouldn't the easier workload apply to you, or did you really want to get in and mix it up?
I was thinking to myself, what I really wanted was to get into the DoD, get my security clearance. I know they had a ton of extra little side programs like tuition assistance. All branches of the military offer it. But I was thinking to myself, if I could keep it on a reasonable workload, especially remembering my job in the hat factory, I knew what it was like to work. And I knew that wasn't necessarily the most pleasurable thing. I wanted to have the gratification of work. I wanted to do something, and I wanted to serve in the military, truth be told. But I also knew that there are incredibly imaginative ways to, use your time as a human, means of labor. So I thought Air Force would be the best.
So this was very strategic, this thinking. And you just said, I cut you off, the Air Force would be the best, but there was nothing there.
Yep. There was, simply put, we met one guy who was recruiting. He was mostly just chilling, watching TV, and said, oh, you can also try the Navy. And that's what we did. And they were much more expedient.
That's funny. It sounds like I always thought they would do anything to get anybody in, but it sounds like he had met his quota.
Yeah. In the Air Force, just a fun fact at the time is, especially in 2014, 2015, they were going through what they themselves called the Hunger Games, where you'd have an entire company of 64 people go in and have maybe 15 come out actually still employed. They were going through a massive downsizing. And the truth of the matter is that they would promote someone to an E6 equivalent. So I think it was a sergeant of some rank. And they're like, all right, well, you are now too expensive for us to really justify your paycheck. Your job is being going down to an E5, and you can enjoy being in the reserves or just, leaving us entirely. So the truth of the matter is I don't even know if they had quotas so much as they just had to be present.
Okay. So the Navy had longer, wider open arms?
Yes, it was actually cosmic. I had it where, because I had a degree, I wanted to start off, I tried off the officer program thing. I did my OAR, which gave me a competitive enough score to try officer. But the truth of the matter is that this is also 2014. There were plenty of young bucks getting out of college looking to, join some sort of military, because the job market didn't exactly lend itself well to everyone. And especially if you have, say, I'll just say it for what it is, one of these joke degrees, these business management, these sociology degrees.
That's okay. I had one of those too. I would concur.
Absolutely. No offense intended to anyone, but nevertheless, they're a lot harder to market, especially when the current job market is inundated with those people. So, but they did get good grades. They're not unintelligent men and women, so they go for the officer program as well. But the difference is they've got a 3.3 in humanities, and I've got like a 2.8 or a 2.9 in engineering. The truth of the matter is, though, is that the GPA number is what matters when you're trying to do service warfare.
Whether it's about anthropology versus electrons.
Yep.
You signed up. Did you go in immediately? Excuse me.
So I went in to take the officer stuff, and they pretty much said, all right, well, we're going to submit this package. We're going to see what you do. But the truth was, I was in the back of my mind, I was thinking, I need to get work. And I don't deal well with, idly sitting by, resting in my laurels, so to speak. So I was like, well, I really want the security clearance. I want to work for the DoD. I didn't actually want to stay in the military forever. I just thought it would be a nice stepping stone.
And is that still part of your strategy?
Absolutely.
So there's no desire to stay in?
No,
okay.
Absolutely not.
Okay. You passed the tests and they took you in?
They'd again set on, submitting a package, right? And then it was recommended to me, we have these really technically challenging jobs on the enlisted side as well, and we can get you started ASAP. Now, for me, having a poor concept is the significant difference between officer and enlisted. I was like, oh, technically challenging. They're like, oh, yes, we have the mental equivalent of the SEALs. It's called our nuke program. And this would be, if I had to point a single point in my life where I don't want to say it was a monolithic mistake, but it was the single point where I could see where the vast majority of my misery was caused is when I raised my eyebrow at, oh, a nuke, eh? And, that's where the record scratch occurs in the movie. And I took the ASVAB test. I got a perfect out of 99. It wasn't necessarily difficult, and a good ASVAB score doesn't mean jack in the real world, but the recruiters, they get wide-eyed. Because being a nuke means a couple of things for them. One, you are double quota, so I count as 2 people if they enlisted up a nuke. If I was female, I was quadruple quota.
So when you say nuke, you mean you're going to be involved with nuclear
power,
fission? Okay.
Yep.
All right.
A lot less exciting than one would
hope. But it seems like you're sort of describing this as it was an error or a mistake on your part, and I would think that nuclear would be very important in the military.
Absolutely, it is.
Okay. And what was the mistake or the?
So the truth of the matter is that the job is something that you can't articulate. And I of course, I should also disclaim at this point that none of my opinions are reflective of the DoD or its affiliates.
Right. We're not on okay, we're not trying to do an investigation.
Yeah, of course. And I will stand by that I love military, I love the Navy, but there are tons of small little problems. And one of the things is being a nuke, you're told, well, you'll be working. And I wasn't afraid of that. I'd known what work was, as we said, from the hat factory. But there's some stuff that you never are really told about. And it's not like it's confidential, but the truth is that you need power to a boat or to a ship. And so, well, you're kind of the first thing on. So long before the CSs, which are our cooks, fine men and women, all of them, but long before they're, making breakfast and, getting stuff cooked, the power is there. We were there for days ahead of time. And when we pull into port and everyone is, just wiping their forehead, it's been a long deployment. It's been a long underway. People are exhausted and they're tired of being cooped up on this, capital ship. The truth of the matter is we have to make sure everything is brought down safely. So while people are walking off, we're still there.
There is a process for powering up.
Mm-hmm.
There's a process for keeping the power up.
Yep.
And then there's a process for powering down.
Yep.
And even though it's nuclear, the source of the power is nuclear, it's still steam, right? Yep. So they're using nuclear to boil water to make steam.
Yep.
And that's hot.
Absolutely.
Are you in quarters, close quarters, where you can feel the heat?
Oh, absolutely. Okay. There's actually...
And that's in the middle of the ship, very deep?
Yeah, very deep.
Okay.
We engine spaces. We actually have a term for people who see sunlight and go out and they're just topsiders. For submariners, you have coners, people at the cone of the ship. And there's actually both visually and culturally large differences between the two. For any nuke, any person who works in engine room spaces, you tend to have a lot less formality on the tidiness of your uniform. You tend to not be so afraid of officers and chiefs. You tend to talk to them like people because you just don't have time for nonsense. You're treating this war machine for what it is.
And is this space that you work in not only warm sometimes, but is it loud?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
You'll have it where, personally, I know I have tinnitus, although it's something I fight whenever we do our audiograms annually. I'll put on those little ear sets and I just hear that ringing. And I'm like, okay, got to do my best to keep this.
So I think I have an understanding about this job now. I actually toured a moored aircraft carrier in San Diego, and I got down into the bowels where the steam was generated. This was diesel.
Yep.
And so if I could just say, if this was 30, 40 years ago and somebody, instead of saying nuke, they said diesel.
I'd probably be either an engineman or a boiler technician.
Okay.
So...
Okay.
And of course, like the differences between that are vast because of the level of safety we take into it.
Right.
There's one thing I'll walk out of the program saying I stand by nuclear power. I find it to be boringly safe. And it's one of those things where if ever I see a person who's questioning the safety of what we produce as what we consider waste, if anyone questions about the safety of it, if they see those large cooling towers with all the steam coming out of it, and they're like, oh my goodness, look at all that radiation. I roll my eyes so hard it actually hurts. And I'm like, look, I may not particularly enjoy, this vocation, so to speak, right now, but nuclear power is nothing if not safe and consistent and reliable.
Right. I think people's attention right now are on coal stacks.
Yeah, absolutely.
You signed up, you got on the bus, you went. Was that a shock? Piece of cake?
It was.
You seem like you're an healthy, fit individual as I'm looking at you.
Yeah, boot camp was interesting, so to speak, because as anyone who's gone through it will tell you, it's one of the easiest things you'll do in the military. But nevertheless, you are dealing with a lot of young kids. And by comparison, that age gap actually reaches hyperbole, wherein you may only be 2 or 3 years older than some of these kids coming out of high school, and yet you feel like an old man. For example, you'll have taps where it's time to go to bed, lights out. You have these red lights that turn on so you can see. It doesn't hurt your night vision, but it also lets you, have people go to sleep. And the minute taps was called, I wanted to go straight to bed. And yet there's these kids who they found new friends. It's a little adventure for them. And they aren't as in line with authority. And that's the thing you'll have with, I see with millennials.
That's an interesting way to say it.
Yeah.
Not as in line with authority.
Yeah. A conformist without a cause, finally given one, so to speak. And there's that weird dichotomy we have in our generation. And we can go into this later, but you have a group that is very good with authority, almost, deeply respects it and sees the importance thereof. And I don't know.
And you're in that group?
Yeah, I'm in that group. I don't know if it's motivated from the idea of, you see authority and you hope one day to attain it, or you see authority and it's been good to you, which I think it has been in my lifetime. And then there are people who, very reasonably are against it. These are probably people from groups who see stuff with, say, police brutality, the people who see a lot of corruption we see in government. And I can see motivations on either side, but it's interesting when you're in such close quarters with all these people, what that really turns into.
There's an age difference.
Yes.
Which is significant at this state.
Mm-hmm.
And then there is an educational difference. You are educated where they're undereducated.
You know what? It would be egotistical for me to say undereducated, because at the end of the day, they come from.
But there were people that did not do the 4 years that you had.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
And it ends up being kind of funny because I boast myself an articulate person, although after meeting a couple people in the Navy, not even officers, but fellow enlisted, and they're even far more verbose than I am. But at the end of the day, after you talk with a few people, you learn that some of these kids, they're out of high school. Some of these kids are barely out of high school. And then one thing that was really weird is a gentleman, his last name was Jones. He had a master's degree. He had taught at multiple universities, and he just joined the Navy. One of a very long line of very intelligent gay men I met in the Navy. He was pretty cool, very articulate, very intelligent man.
Now it's okay to say that there are gay men and gay women and
yes,
straight men and straight women in the Navy, and all that's fine. You're a mini civilization, just like out here. Okay.
Absolutely.
Let's talk about that. So are you on a boat or a ship?
Currently on a ship.
Okay. What kind of ship is it?
It is an aircraft carrier.
Oh, one of the biggest ones.
Yes, indeed.
And I've heard that described as a mini city.
Yes, that's a pretty fair summary I'd put of it.
Do you feel the scale of that, for example, in people alone? Are there people that you run into that you've never seen before and you've all been on the ship for a while? Yes. Is it that big?
You will absolutely have people that you see and you're like, I have no idea who you are. And you'll pass them in conversation. Perhaps you're waiting in line for chow. And for me, I try to be a little bit more vocal, despite the separation between, those of us who work on the guts of the ship and then topside who deals with more with air and stuff. There's a pretty big separation, but I don't like to separate them too much as far as like who I socialize with. And you'll see, oh, they were working here for 3 years. I've never seen them.
Is there, I don't know, this isn't the right word, caste, but is there a segregation based on what you do on the ship and where you work? You mentioned topside and the air.
Yeah. And you'll even have that as far as, the smaller departments working what I work with, right? Mm-hmm. You have your same cast of characters of your immediate chain of command, the people you work with day to day. And then as that spreads out to actually like geographically on the ship where you work, I know there's some mechanics near where I'm at. So you tend to talk with them.
So
nearby.
Even like in a real city, there's the bad side of town or the the other side of the tracks or some concepts like that.
It's a little bit weird. One thing you're talking about in boot camp is actual gangs that can sometimes occur in the Navy, which on an aircraft carrier, it is the weirdest mix of, due to the bureaucracy of the Navy, you'll have it where they have a high standard for certain things set there. And then yet due to the raw amount of personnel there are individuals who can pretty much skate by without doing absolutely anything.
People who have figured out the system.
Yep, absolutely. And it's a little bit unfortunate to see, but you end up having it where, you can definitely see where the vast majority of work on the ship gets done,
Right.
and who ends up doing it. And unfortunately, it tends to be nukes,
Right.
as well as what conventionals we work with, who are also really smart men and women.
Is there a brig?
Yes, there is.
Or do you ever hear about people in the brig?
Yes.
Okay.
In fact, one thing of current, hot topic, so to speak, is bread and water as a punishment. The last archaic punishment the Navy got rid of in the late 1800s was cat and nine tails. And the next one we're thinking about of getting rid of is bread and water. And the whole process behind that is, you commit some sort of crime. We'll say, easiest one is DUI. Navy has zero tolerance for that. And so they'll be like, oh, okay, you messed up royally, but we don't want to get you out of this job. So you'll do a non-judicial punishment, also known as NJP. The captain will be the one to do that. So it's not on your permanent record. Police aren't called. But then the captain will go through this long hearing process that I won't bore you with details here. But eventually we'll say that it's bread and water. Let's say you did something really bad, like you also were found selling pot. And they're like, oh, okay, this is going to get handled. So you'll go to a process where you go to medical. And they're like, okay, you aren't criminally under or overweight. Your heart can handle it. You are physically capable of undergoing bread and water. It's not just the fact that you have 3 days of only bread and water. It's the fact that you're in the brig, in a very confined space. The only people you'll see are the master-at-arms, the police. And I've heard stories of stuff, for example, they'll bring you down raisin bread and they'll throw it on the floor. And as you're about to take a bite, they'll say, hey, your punishment is bread and water, not raisins and bread and water. And they'll have you pick out the raisins. If you eat it, of course, they have unique ways of making you pay for that.
But that's not the Navy doing that as much as maybe that individual who has learned it from another brig individual who's, is the captain upstairs who's having dinner aware that you're picking, not you, but they're, or is that just part of once you get down into that system?
By and large, bread and water is understood to be one of the most severe punishments. Funnily enough, it's not even the worst part of it because that's only done in 3 days, but you'll end up being on restriction. So you'll be stuck on the ship 60 days. You're not allowed to cross the quarterdeck. And very boring, very tiring.
What's the quarterdeck for us?
Quarterdeck is the place where you come on and off the ship.
Okay,
for an aircraft carrier, usually it's one of the hangar bays.
So you're on a ship-bound parole.
Yep.
Okay. So it sounds like the Navy, obviously I do understand the need for nipping things in the bud.
Absolutely.
Sounds like unless there is a severe law broken that they take care of things themselves.
Yes.
That's both good and bad for the criminal, so to speak, in that things tend to stay off their record, civilian-like, but then they don't have a good appeals process either.
Yeah. Well, actually, we do have a couple of appeals process in there, but it's also up to the discretion of higher-ups in the Navy.
Right.
I have a friend of mine who, for example, he was drunk in public, which he admitted to, and then he happened to be near in the proximity of some kids who were underage drinking, which is one of those. That's what separates it from one of those slap on the wrist. You messed up. We're gonna put you. You're gonna be stuck on the ship, and we're taking a paycheck. To, oh my gosh, you're about to be kicked out of the Navy. And the truth is that he had an actual confession from them. He said during his hearing, which is pretty much during the mast. The captain's mast is like the official hearing for the non-judicial punishment. He requested the phone call, said, hey, can you call these people to verify that I did not provide alcohol? And the captain ended up denying it and saying, no, we're not going to go with that call. And of course, there's also lawyers. You can bring it to a court-martial, which is very scary because a court-martial could totally acquit you entirely. They could just be like, all right, this isn't worth our trouble. Or you can have it where the court-martial is run by some very high-up people. It will show up on your actual civilian record. And they'll be like, well, not only were you drunk in public, but due to informality of your process hearing and lack of clean uniform, we're also adding that charge. So, and it'll be a much more severe punishment. So they like to make it look like a very rough gamble. So if you're absolutely in the right, you should feel free to do it. But if there's any hesitation as to whether or not it's worth a court-martial, they want you to be as afraid as possible to use that.
So these things that you're describing now, these ways, these are cultural behaviors belonging to this organization.
Absolutely.
How easy or difficult is it to learn about being Navy, being military, and how quickly do you have to learn these things, and how do you learn them? There's book learning.
Mm-hmm.
You have a rule book. Never do this, always do that.
Yep.
But then there's this intangible aspect of learning how to be in the Navy. Does that make sense? Does that question make sense?
There's that cultural zeitgeist you have to assimilate into.
Yes.
And
Thank you, zeitgeist.
Absolutely. And there is one. And what's really weird is it'll change as you go through. So, for example, in boot camp, you are brought up in the highest regard, so to speak. You're told to have your boots polished. Your uniform is tucked away. Your rack is pretty much alphabetized. You know how to march perfectly, which is actually something that is functionally unused in the Navy nowadays. They did it to echo the Army's boot camp training. In fact, when I was going through boot camp, many of our RDCs were used to calling it a company rather than a division. But those are the small things. Then you'll go through training, and as a nuke, that's a 2-year long process. It's huge. And the culture changes to one where you're not so worried about the exact perfection of your uniform, but it's studying. It's knowing these things. It's having a perfect understanding of nuclear power and these maths behind it. And you'll have it where it was not uncommon to have people spending upwards of 60, 70, 80 hours a week in these buildings just studying. For example, I remember them telling us, "Oh yeah, it's all confidential, so you won't have any homework." What they didn't tell you is you'd be making, your new home would be inside the building, which they could make you go into. They actually had a program that forced you to be in there for certain periods, which were logged. A very 1950s approach, which echoes the foundations of Admiral Rickover, who came up with that. There's a lot of documentation you can read on him. He's this jerk stepfather every nuke has, where we half admire him and half hate him due to the program, but whatever your perspective is, everyone goes through it. And the zeitgeist there is pretty much, being knowledgeable, showing that you're studying and otherwise trying to keep sane. You're not worried about the small fluff on the side. You're just doing your best to keep your classwork set together. And then when you move on to prototype and into the fleet, prototype's the last stage of nuke training. And when you move to the fleet, the whole thing is qualifying, which is showing that you can do new jobs, and it's getting work done. And I can't speak to topside because I don't know that culture. They tend to be very spick and span. They tend to be very professional sounding, but at the end of the day, the amount of workload they have is significantly less. So for us, I live on the ship, and it's been a boon to me because that means I can very quickly step into work and then step out of work. And it's this, the real zeitgeist there, the real personality isn't, addressing people perfectly or saluting every single officer. That stuff kind of comes as a habit. And shoot, even nowadays, I'll have times I'm walking through the hangar bay and I just nonchalantly see a commander who otherwise would throw a whole tizzy if I didn't salute him, but I'll miss it entirely. And as long as he doesn't bring anything up, I don't think twice.
So these things you just described are important. They're career related.
Mm-hmm.
They involve your job and studying. And what about socially with other people on board? Is
Mm-hmm.
there a thing called being Navy or
actually,
the way you interact with other people, and it's a Navy way. I understand saluting, studying, long hours, doing your job. But in between that, you're around, 5,000, 6,000 other people on this ship. And there's a subculture.
Yeah.
How is that?
It's actually quite weird because it separates depending on your, exactly who's in your chain of command. So, for us, right, you'll have it where, there's small little cultural, hints. For example, having a uniform, we have this flame resistant, uniform. If it's, totally covered in paint, it makes you look bad. But if it's perfectly clean, it makes it look like either you just got a new one and people will point it out, or you maybe haven't done a whole lot.
So the uniform is telling, but you got to be careful of what it tells. You're either not doing the job, or you're brand new at it. You're a newbie, or you're.
And there's nothing worse than being new. The term is a nub.
A nub,
yeah, which is they say it's a new underway buddy, but it means a non-useful body. So and that means you're not qualified.
Have you graduated from that?
Not yet. Not until you're once you can do every job. We're also being called senior in rate. That's when you're no longer.
So this is actually a little more formal than informal. That's a real term.
Yes,
it's not a subculture.
It's something
prisoner term.
Yeah, it's something that they try to keep us away from saying. You also have If you spell it out, currently unqualified nuclear technician, which
Got it.
is one we also stay away from. But we know what it means. The Navy doesn't like to have us say that vocally, but the truth is that when you're in job of it,
I'm surprised that term exists because they're now.
Oh yeah, they do their best to hammer down on all that hazing stuff.
Yeah, there's now different genders and professed genders and likes and dislikes. But
that whole program came through. It's actually been a really weird thing because they did their best to integrate that, and I don't think there's anyone here who wants to reduce the amount of people that can join the military. And there's plenty of fine Americans of however they identify who are
many
ready to serve.
different persuasions. Yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But the logistical way the Navy tried to approach it was very weird. And I remember we got a briefing on it one day, and it just felt so haberdashed. And again, I think at the end of the day, like many problems the Navy suffers, it's from someone at a very high position, usually with a few stars, an admiral of some description, has this killer idea. And he's like, what'd be great is if we had more diversity. And he sees this term diversity on his wall, on his motivational poster, and he strokes his chin and he thinks, yes, this is the thing. And he goes down to someone who can do something about it. He goes to a chief or another officer, says, we're going to increase diversity. The officer doesn't have any idea logistically how to employ this. And he's like, well, what do you mean, sir? And he comes up with some idea, right? We'll say one of the more recent ones that's known to be terrible is let's get more females on submarines. Australia does that. That's great. Well, the logistics behind this are a real problem because it's multifold. For example, you have to separate berthings now. Australia doesn't do that, but we do because that's what's politically set up in the US.
America. Yeah.
America.
Yeah.
And then you have bathrooms that are being set up because some of them had urinals, even though most people who work as hygiene techs admit urinals smell terrible and they're a real logistical nightmare. Some of that had to be shifted around. And then what's worse is you look at the actual numbers for female officers who act as liaisons for the enlisted females. And the truth is they're looking at like a 3% retention because it turns out when you go on a submarine, they're called pig boats for a reason. They are disgusting. They're no fun to be on. They are a lot of work. They are, I have an incredible amount of respect. And there's a lot of, as a nuke, you go one of two places. You go onto a capital carrier or you go into a submarine. I have a great deal of respect for submariners. And it's not an easy job. I would easily say that their job is harder than mine. But the truth of the matter is that it's a job that's got to get done.
Back to the females. There are onboard romances, correct?
Yes.
And how is that looked upon?
Terrible. You don't do it.
So people have that extra bit of overhead of, hey, this is not allowed, therefore it's wicked, and by God, we can't get caught either.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's
so there's probably a whole sub-routine, not to use the word submarine, but there's a routine for being discreet.
Yeah.
Nooks and crannies.
Absolutely. I remember
closets and
fan
laundry
rooms.
chutes and...
One famous story that circulated around was there was a lieutenant who was walking around doing a zone inspection, and he walks up to one of these fan rooms, and his words were, he sniffs the air, he's like, it smells like sex in here, and he walks around and he sees two CSs, the cooks, just like being as still as possible, as though he's a T-Rex. His vision is based on motion, and he just starts shaking his head, and he's like, this is going to be an interesting day. Not only did the zone not do exactly very well on its inspection, but you had two people go up, 4 people come down, and they're like, oh yeah, this is going to be a long day.
Okay. So it happens. Do you ever get up on the flight deck? And then we've got to get out of the Navy because there's so much of life left. But
absolutely.
Do you ever get up on the flight
Yes.
deck and is that exciting? And
Oh,
you
absolutely.
see these guys land and...
What's nuts is, I remember one of the most beautiful visions I had in the Navy was, it was late at night and we were doing drills because nukes don't sleep. We actually have special instructions that say, despite the Navy having an instruction saying we need 8 hours, we have a special nuke note that says the plants come first. So you'll have it not uncommon to only get 3 or 4 hours of sleep. I can attest to that. That's not people speaking in hyperbole, even less qualified people. And if you are fully qualified, which means you can do more, you're going to be doing more. But the whole thing was we're doing a drill and I look outside the hangar bay and it's just nothing but ocean. And I see a full moon echoing across those waves just perfectly. The water was just still enough to see a perfect reflection of the moon as I'm walking somewhere more forward to respond to the drill. I just think to myself, I'm like, this is cosmic. And then you look at on the flight deck, you get up on what's called Vulture's Row. So you have the bridge or the island on the aircraft carrier. you actually get on some of those catwalks if as long as certain flight operations aren't going on. If they are, those are usually vacated to non-professionals, which I fully admit as a nuke, I don't have a great understanding of the aircraft. The catapults I know, the steam I know, but the actual gut work of that top stuff, especially the heat. There's stories of people who are just a little bit too close, and the last thing they have is a camera in their hands before it's cauterized to their face and they're dead. So you got to be really careful. But to see that massive flight deck, it's just a floating city, and you know how fast it can go, and looking around just pure blue ocean. Or sometimes you'll do alongside operations. You see another ship hooked up jet fuel coming across, and you're like, it's the closest thing to ballet that a giant city can do.
And have you been privileged enough to see the planes land?
Yes, we actually
and
have
also to be jettisoned off.
Yes, I've seen them both on camera, and one time I was lucky enough to see one take off on the flight deck.
I mean, the power that you must feel in your chest.
It's beautiful.
And they still got those guys in the yellow or red or green jackets that kneel down and the plane goes off over them.
Yeah, known as Skittles, because each jacket color means a different job, but they actually work some of the crazier hours, all things considered. When we're not doing flight ops, they've got some pretty easy life. But when we're actually sending birds to fly, it is incredible. And you get to see the whole song and dance they go through. It's pretty impressive.